As part of the increasing sanctions against Russia following their invasion of the Ukraine, the G7 countries, plus Australia, and the EU 27 member bloc have agreed to impose a price cap on Russian seaborne oil. Oil deliveries via pipeline to landlocked countries like Hungary are exempt so that these countries could come on board too. The price cap will be enforced by denying insurance, shipping, and other maritime services to all shipments priced above the price cap, as a means of both severely limiting Russian oil revenues while keeping their oil on the market to avoid massive spikes in the global price of oil. At the beginning of December 2022, all parties agreed to set the initial cap at $60 per barrel, and while it will change over time, it is expected to stay range-bound between $40 and $70 per barrel. So, how do these compare to recent oil prices? Well, the Urals price for Russian oil averaged just under $70 over the past 2 months, basically at the top of the expected cap range. Although it did weaken to close out November at about $61, close to the agreed-upon cap. However, both the announced cap and cap range are well below the leading global benchmark for Atlantic Basin crude oil at Brent, which averaged about $93 a barrel over the same period, dipping to $86 most recently. This is critical as about 60% of the Russian government's revenue comes from the sale of oil and natural gas. That being said, under the cap, total oil supply and global prices are not expected to be impacted as much as they will be under the sanction prohibiting or banning the purchase of Russian oil altogether. So, how will the price cap work? Essentially, the cap will apply worldwide to all countries that have not yet banned Russian oil imports by tanker. Vessels from countries with large shipping industries such as Malta, Greece and Cyprus will still be able to transport Russian oil if it is priced below the cap. EU member states are also banning Russian seaborne oil imports effective December 5th of this year. The EU will also establish a monitoring system which would assess circumvention practices intent on avoiding the price cap. If the EU's executive found a significant loss of business due to evasive measures, the EU would be able to propose mitigation measures against the country to avoid fallout. The U.S. Department of Treasury recently published their preliminary guidance on implementation of a maritime service policy and related price exemption for seaborne Russian oil. Wow, only politicians could come up with a title like that, eh? Anyway, the U.S. defined the cap implementation as, quote, a policy with regards to a broad range of services related to the maritime transportation of Russian Federation origin crude oil and petroleum products. The document further describes the process of how to avoid circumvention practices related to the price cap. As about 95% of the world's oil tanker fleet is insured by the International Group of Protection and Indemnity Clubs in London and some firms based in continental Europe, owners of oil vessels belonging to any country will refuse to carry Russian oil if they can't get high-grade insurance. Important as the operators of the Suez Canal do not permit uninsured ships to sail through the channel. Governments will impose a rule that the tanker insurance will not be provided if oil is sold above the price cap, but would still be issued if the sale is below. This will help to control purchases of Russian oil under a price cap. In response, the government-backed Russian National Reinsurance Company is expected to provide the reinsurance that British and European insurers refuse to issue. And finally, as noted earlier, the price cap will be reviewed on a regular basis going forward and will certainly be adjusted up and down depending on market conditions at the time. Naturally, there are both pros and cons to the price cap. On the pro side, first, reductions in Russian oil export volumes will not be as dramatic as they would be under a full ban on Russian oil imports, but they can be redirected and wouldn't significantly reduce oil supply or affect an already tight market. Russian oil production is expected to decline as operating costs in certain regions would be higher than revenue. In fact, the Russian Ministry of Energy expects production to drop 7.5% in 2023 compared to 2022, although the actual drop can be significantly different. To put it in perspective, Russia produced 9.9 million barrels per day in October, about the same as a year ago. Secondly, the cap should not lead to increased prices for consumers, as the total amount of oil in the market will not be much less. As for the cons, 1. For the price cap to work, all major buyers of Russian oil must agree on the maximum price. Since the EU, with some exceptions, the UK and the US have already stopped buying Russian oil, or will stop buying it shortly, the cap must be supported by other buyers, in particular China and India. However, it is unclear if these countries will join a cartel, and the U.S. and allies, unfortunately, don't have enough economic instruments to convince them to do it. While China and India would be in favor of lower prices for Russian oil, they would prefer to rely on the current Urals-Brent price differentials as opposed to a cap to reduce the price. 2. OPEC may also be against a cap, as it may create a precedent and negatively affect oil markets. And actually, this impacted OPEC's recent decision to cut production by 2 million barrels per day, although that decision may not be implemented immediately. 3. If the price cap is too low, Russia may refuse to sell oil to countries which set up the cap, as their revenue would be lower than cost. This would lead to increased global prices due to the limited amount of oil on the market. Basically, Russia would generate its revenue on smaller volumes, but at a greater price. 4. The mechanism to control the cap would be complex and has never been tested, so rest assured some companies will try to find a way around the cap, for example by possibly blending Russian oil with oil from other countries. And finally, 5. There are significant challenges in calculating the actual cap due to difficulties in estimating the cost of Russian oil. Incorrys estimates the cost of Russian oil to be between $13 and $45, depending if it's full cycle cost, half cycle cost, or just operational expenses. It also depends greatly on the basin itself. If full cycle cost is used as the basis, the Russian government may try to use sale proceeds to finance the war, rather than invest back into future exploration and development. In closing, this chart illustrates Incorrys' latest forecast of the Urals oil price used for Russian budget projections. The 2023 price increases from about $67 in 2022 to just over $70 before declining to the $65 level in 2025. According to Russian budget projections, even a Urals price of $70 will lead to a budget deficit of 2% of GDP. If the price is less than 70, as we are projecting, the budget deficit will be greater and will have to be covered by the Russian Reserve Fund. So although the price cap may reduce Russian oil revenue, its impact would be muted as the current Urals price is already below Russian budget projections. Russia will try to mitigate the negative effects on oil price by postponing some oil and exploration development and a partial devaluation of their currency. However, Incorrys expects that within the next 1 to 1.5 years, a greater reduction of oil revenue will lead to an accelerated depletion of an already dwindling reserve fund.